It's important because it's, I think, the most penetrating and incisive account of a relationship. In some ways, it's the most important international relationship of the United States. In some ways, Israel is the closest ally of the United States. And I think the basis of the relationship is often misunderstood. And Amy Kaplan's book, I think, brilliantly analyzes and exposes the roots of this relationship, frankly, in a way that nothing in the IR field, nothing in political science, nothing that I've ever seen does in quite the same way.
It tells the story of the story. Our American Israel is a book about the story about Israel that has been crafted in American public life and public imagination. And for somebody who was raised to understand that in a very particular context of what's happening in my own community, in the American Jewish community, I really just found it so eye-opening to understand the ways that that story has always been a very American story, and the way that the American public understands Israel is as much about Americans' own need for a particular story about ourselves as it is about what's happening in that place over there.
Our American Israel matters and has mattered since it was published because of the way it describes with great attention and subtlety the changing meaning of Israel for different groups of Americans. So many people have told the history of how American Jews have thought about Israel, or a few have written about what it means to American evangelical Christians. But no one has taken the long arc of Israel's history, from the history of Zionism before Israel's founding to the post 9/11 period, and described the complex ways that many types of Americans, American Protestants, liberals, conservatives, American Jews too, and others have encountered what we can describe as the story or even the dream of Israel. And to her great credit, she does this without ever condescending to Israelis or to the people who fell in love with Israel. But she also never loses sight of that alliance as something that was constructed, sometimes mythical, and also subject to change.
It's not just a study of relations between two countries. It's a study of the cultural connections, the personal, family, and other connections between Israel and the United States that helps to explain the depth and the closeness of this bond. I think her dissection of the way the media plays a role in the relationship between the United States and Israel is lucid, and it's convincing, and it's brilliantly researched. In particular, the movie Exodus, how much of an impact that movie had in framing in a specific way with a handsome Paul Newman, how though that phenomenon played an outsized role in shaping what everybody who ever saw the movie or read the book understood about Israel. That's one of the, in my view, one of the key takeaways from this book. I realize this every time I talk to an audience over 50 or 60. There's hardly a person in the room who hasn't seen the movie or read the book. It had an enormous impact, and she builds on that and explains how not just Exodus the film, Exodus the book, but a variety of other cultural products, but mainly movies and television, created an image of Israel, which I would argue still among older people still prevails to this day.
Something that really surprised and interested me that I learned in the book is that Exodus was created during the McCarthy era, where most political films were heavily censored, couldn't get funding. And the fact that Exodus could be made during that time is also a very clear demonstration of how Zionism has always been an idea and a movement that was very much in the American national interest, or seen as part in the American national interest.
The thing that stuck with me most was going back to the introduction, where she says really clearly, and I'm just going to quote it here, where she says, "This book aims to recover the strangeness of an affinity that has come to be seen as self-evident. In 1945, it was not inevitable that a global superpower emerging victorious from World War II would come to identify with a small state for Jewish refugees. How was the creation of a Jewish state in the Middle East translated into a narrative that reflected cherished American tales of national origins? How, in other words, did so many come to feel that the bond between the United States and Israel was historically inevitable, morally right, and a matter of common sense? I think that really just lays out the book right there in a beautiful way.
One of the first phrases that really struck me in the book is this phrase, invincible victim. As somebody who was raised in a Zionist community, that idea was just considered a basic truth about Israel. The idea that it was both like completely invincible, powerful, the power of the state, the power of the military was something that was celebrated and revered. And at the same time, there was this constant idea that it was also that the state was always on the brink of destruction, that Jewish people were always on the verge of annihilation after the Holocaust. She really convincingly explains how this contradictory idea was really cemented in the cultural production, namely through Exodus, but through other films and cultural products that were created after the founding of the state.
That it explained to me shifts in American public opinion around Israel and Palestine, starting with a lot of media, books and movies in the 50s and 60s and 70s, but especially after the 1982 war, after the first intifada of the late 1980s, early 1990s. It showed me how both Israel's image has been negatively impacted by some, positively created and then negatively impacted by some events, and how Israel has managed, Israel and its supporters have managed to recuperate what was lost in, say, the enormously negative coverage of the 1982 war, for example, or the enormously negative coverage of the first Intifada. Kids with rocks against tanks. Um, and I think that is an analysis that stands to this day. You've had events that have extremely negatively impacted Israel's image in American public consciousness, and then a extraordinarily well-developed counterattack. I mean, obviously, the book was published before this Gaza war, long before, but you just take that frame and bingo, it works today. And so, I mean, it shows what a great historian she was, that she's able to see a pattern which you can see going into the present.
For me, it was really the 1982 chapter, the one about the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, that was so powerful, because she argues that this is a moment when images of Israel really begin to change in the United States, that American newscasters and others begin to see Israel as having made a war of choice rather than of necessity. They begin to see Israel as an aggressor rather than simply a victim. They begin to ask hard questions about what was going on in Lebanon. And what I had not really thought about was how, for me, I had been working at Newsweek magazine in 1982 as an intern, a summer intern, when Israel invaded Lebanon. And I had all sorts of opinions about Israel, but when I read, and I was the fact checker for that part of the stories that came out in Newsweek, and I was like, what is happening here? And I was really following much more closely than I would have. And it did also change my life and my views, because I was paying attention to the ways in which Israel was bombing civilians and attacking people who seemed quite defenseless. And so I was able to understand my own history, the transformation that happened for me historically, in a way that I had not before. And so that really has had an impact on my life.
As someone who's part of a younger generation of American Jewish activists who are questioning the narratives that we were raised with, and this book just gave me such a helpful roadmap to how the stories that I was raised with, where did they come from? How were they developed? How do they map onto broader American political trends and discourse? And um, also just reminded me that the questions that we're asking today and the struggles that we're facing have a really deep history to them.
The other way that the book has affected me is I felt sad that until this reissue, it has not had the kind of impact that it should have had. I think it really would help people to understand things that they never understood about this American-Israeli relationship and how that reflects on American understanding, or I actually say misunderstanding, of everything to do with Palestine. And so I'm very happy that the book is coming out in paperback again. I think it's a book for any reader who would like to understand the role of this extraordinary role of Israel in American public life, where it comes from, and why it is so prominent, which I think should be every citizen, because the United States is joined at the hip to Israel and has always been um, since Harry Truman. There's not an American president who didn't spend an inordinate amount of time um, paying attention to Israel one way or another. So it's an enormously important issue in American foreign policy, but it's an enormously important issue in American daily life, political life, cultural life. I mean, the number of books, just the number of articles, the number of movies, the number of TV shows, news broadcasts, whatever, that relate to Israel. I mean, this is a tiny little country. We're not talking China, India, Brazil. We're talking, a few tens of 10, 12, whatever it is, 15 million people. And yet it has this inordinately large place in American public life. And I think this book really helps to understand that. And I think every citizen should read it, because whatever Israel does, the United States is doing, whether we realize it or not, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. So you might as well understand how this connection emerged and what it consists of and why it has this strength and this elasticity and this ability to overcome all kinds of external events.
I would have answered that differently 2 years ago. I would have said students or everybody, and that's still true. But after the war in Gaza, I would like to have everybody who looks at what happened in Gaza and who instinctively feels that this is wrong, that the destruction of civilian life, that the destruction of those cities is just wrong. And yet they're also unsure about how to be critical of that, which is to say being critical of Israel without playing into anti-Semitism. And those instincts are right. One should be careful of anti-Semitism always. And I think that's why this book is so valuable. It's not a handbook, but it shows us that Israel's image in the US has been a broad project with many people and many groups who have their own interest in constructing a narrative of Israel that makes it untouchable, a military ally, yet also really moral, that makes that little country such a big part of the American imagination. And to understand that historically allows you to understand that to be critical of what Israel does is part of our responsibility, really, as Americans, because of how closely the US has allied itself with Israel. Just as to be critical of what the US does is part of our responsibility as Americans. And I hope that this book can help people see their way to taking the moral position that comes kind of wells up from people when they see what was happening in Gaza, but then they stop themselves because they think there's no way to do that without doing something morally wrong. And I think this book can really show you how to have a moral, serious critique of Israel that also takes anti-Semitism quite seriously as well. I loved Amy so much, and so I'm just so happy to get to be part of it. And yeah.
She was a wonderful person. You didn't have the privilege, perhaps, of meeting her. She was just a wonderful, this low key, incredibly articulate, quiet woman, prodigiously intelligent, and with this enormous depth in terms of her background in understanding the history of American culture that she brought to this book. I mean, it's a fitting tribute to her. It's her last book. That it should be so amazingly good.